and welcome to today's episode of VETChat. I'm Kathryn Bell, CEO of the Webinar Vet, and today I am incredibly excited to be joined by Daniella Dos Santos, and we are going to be talking all about flexible working in the veterinary profession. Before we get started, let me introduce our guest today. Director of Professional Culture at IVC Evidentia, Daniella is a veterinary surgeon who graduated from the Royal Veterinary College in 2012. Over the years, she has worked in various clinical settings across southern England. In 2019 to 2020, she served as the president of the British Veterinary Association, guiding the profession through the unprecedented challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic. In recognition of her leadership, Daniella was awarded the RCVS Inspiration Award in 2021 and became a fellow of the RCVS for her contributions to the profession that same year. Passionate about animal welfare, she also serves as a trustee for the Pet Plan Charitable Trust. So welcome, Daniella. Thank you so much for joining me today.
No worries, and thank you for having me.
It's lovely to see you not on a Sunday afternoon. We used to do weekly during the pandemic.
It's good to have my free Sundays again.
Yeah, absolutely. So flexible working, I feel like there's such an increased focus on it at the moment, not just in the veterinary space, but in general in the UK. So to kick us off, do you want to tell us a little bit about how it's typically managed in the veterinary profession currently?
It's a difficult question to answer because I think it really, really does vary across the sector, whether it's small animal, farm animal, equine practice, whether it's clinical, non-clinical, charity, private practice and so on. It's managed slightly differently just because of the different ways we work, right? And the different pressures we have. And, for example, if you're working in farm or equine practice, there's still the issue with covering your own out of hours in most cases and so on and so forth. So I think it's difficult to say that it's covered in a particular way. I think what is fair to say, it's got increased focus over the last few years, and rightly so. Mm-hmm. And I think what you'll find is that the decisions are being made at local level to try and balance the needs of the individuals in question and also the business, so that we can make sure that we have people with a good work-life balance, but also that we're delivering the best care that we can to our patients.
Yeah, okay, absolutely. And I guess there are lots of challenges that practices face when they are trying to implement flexible working. What types of challenges have you kind of come across in the profession?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting because when you start talking about flexible working, the first thing people often think about is it's part-time, or someone doesn't want to work evenings, or someone doesn't want to work weekends. And actually, in reality, the truth is often completely different to that. So I think some of the challenges that the profession is facing are probably understanding what flexible working actually means and thinking outside the box beyond the typical that we've just said, but also then balancing the needs of a client and being able to see a vet when they need to see a vet, and the needs of the individual and the needs of the business. So I think there's a couple of challenges. I think there's challenges around the perception of what flexible working means. There's challenges around what the solutions are available to them. And I think there's also a fear quite often from those who are leading practices that they fear that they could get it wrong, or that if they agree to it for one person, it means they have to agree to it for everyone. So there are a few myths out there that make it much harder as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Because you're right. I guess we always say at the Webinar Vet, we work very flexibly, but I guess it's much easier for us in a sense because we can kind of work anywhere where we've got, a Wi-Fi connection, because a lot of us do work remotely. But I guess in practice, if you're in a leadership role, it's quite difficult to know where to start.
So yes, it is difficult to know where to start, but I think it's just we have to take that first step. So flexible working isn't just about part-time, right? It could be something like annualized hours. It could be a job share. It could be a flexible rota that changes, every week or every 2 weeks or so on. It could be 0 hours contract. There are so many different things that flexible working could be. So for me, for example, when I was junior vice president, I worked flexibly in the clinic I worked at. Now, I worked in a clinic that was 24-hour clinic. So it's pretty complicated to try and get flexible working when you've got to cover 24/7 care. And actually, for me, where it ended up was, I said, right, I need a rota 6 weeks in advance, and I can tell you the days 6 weeks in advance that I can't work. So that was what I needed. But in return, for the business, I said, but when I am available, you can choose the hours I work. Okay. And so the flexible working piece, often we think it's just a one-way thing. What does the staff member need, but actually it's a two-way street. What does the staff member need? What does the business need? And where is the meet in the middle? Or where is the compromise? Or where is the different type of rota pattern that we can be thinking about?
So just sticking with, talking about
Yeah.
leaders within veterinary practice, if you've got some leaders who are hesitant to embrace flexible working, what would your advice be to them?
I'd say to them, first of all, they shouldn't be hesitant. They have a duty to at least consider flexible working requests. But I also wouldn't be scared about it, and I'd go in with a really open mind rather than going, oh gosh, this is all going to be about mothers. It shouldn't just be about mothers, but that's what we're facing at the moment. That it's all going to be about mothers that just want to work school hours, don't want to work weekends, don't want to work evenings, etc., etc. That's rarely the case. Yes, there are some that's where it lies, but actually, when we look at some of the data and the research that we've done, childcare or caring duties was the third most common reason for wanting flexible working. Work-life balance and leisure activities were the other reason. So I would say to line managers, be really open-minded. Now, I know of someone who was, over a decade qualified. The flexible working request they put in is they just wanted to finish an hour earlier on a Tuesday so they could get to their running club. And actually, their running club only started, so they wanted to finish at 6 instead of 7, and their running club started at 6:30. It was only 5 minutes down the road. Now, the reason they did that is they understood that sometimes there'll be emergencies, etc., and they were giving themselves some leeway to get there on time. Their request was refused because the practice leader said, if I do it for you, I have to do it for everyone else. And so what that meant was that person left. And so they left, they lost, a really experienced vet for the sake of an hour. So if you are a leader, don't get anxious about it to start with. Have a little listen, go away and think about it. Quite often people come with requests expecting some form of compromise. So expecting to be like, I'm not going to get everything I need. So where's the give and take? And that's absolutely what we should be thinking about when it comes to flexible working.
Brilliant. Yeah, that's just crazy, isn't it? To think of that, for the sake of an
Yeah,
hour, they've got the whole,
exactly.
recruitment problem again to deal with.
Exactly.
And I guess have you observed like a link between retention and flexible working?
Yeah, absolutely. When we're talking about flexible working in its broadest sense, right? So not when we're talking about just part-time working. When we're talking about flexible working in its broadest sense, absolutely. Because what happens is people will come to work more enthused, happier. They're working the hours they want to work to manage whatever else it is that they're trying to manage in their life, because they want to go, I don't know, running because they've got family to take care of. Actually, they've got annualized hours because they want to go on holiday for 4 weeks a year. And people feel more valued when a flexible working request is agreed to, or even if it's agreed to in part. As I say, it's a two-way thing. They feel more valued, they feel more inspired at work, they feel more loyal to the workplace. Therefore, you do get retention benefits, but it's not just retention benefits. The quality of care being delivered is likely to be higher as well, because people are not as tired, people are more fresh-faced, people are happier to be at work. And there is a really beautiful cycle where if we can find the compromise and the way to work together to get flexible working, there is a real benefit, not just for the individual, but for the business and for our patients.
I was going to say, actually, if how does it impact duty of care? Because I would imagine that's probably a concern at some point for somebody who is in practice and is considering all the various options.
Sure. It shouldn't is the answer, because actually, when it comes to flexible working requests, you don't have to say yes to everything. They have to benefit the business and or meet the needs of the business, should I say. And in the veterinary world, one of the needs of the business is to provide 24/7 care and to provide continuity of care. Now, continuity of care does not need to be the same individual. Just to be clear, you can have job shares, and if you've got really, really good handover protocols and so on, there is a continuity of care. Or if you have someone who works part-time, does a job share or something like that, continuity of care is easily achievable with good client communication as well. So, for example, when I was in practice, when I was working condensed hours, if I had an animal that I'd been seeing regularly for a chronic condition and it came in for a blood test or an investigation, but I knew I did it on the Wednesday and I knew I wouldn't be in until the next Monday, it's about me saying to the client, I won't be able to get back to you until next week with your results. If you don't hear anything, it's nothing to worry about. But my colleague will be able to look at the results in my absence, and if it's urgent, we will call you. So it's about managing client expectations around what hours you're in and when to expect to hear back. But also making sure you've got that backup, because you never know what's going to happen. And just so someone is aware of what's going on in case the patient needs to be seen whilst you're not there.
So it sounds like it all does, a large part of it all does come down to communication
Oh,
and
absolutely.
managing expectations as well.
And that's both within and outside the team. At one point I was very part-time because of the BVA stuff and things like that. But my clients still came back to see me. They knew what hours I worked, what days I worked, and they were fine with it. If it's an emergency, they would see someone else. So it is really about good communication, both with your clients and within the team, because actually, if you are part-time, you do, or flexible hours where you work intermittently and so on, it is really important to make sure that your team and your colleagues know exactly what's going on with those longer term patients as well.
Brilliant. Why do you think it is that there's so much more talk of flexible working now? Like, do you think it is post-pandemic? Do you think people's, sort of expectations have changed, or what are your
I
thoughts on
think
that?
I think it's a bit of both, if I'm honest. I think flexible working was already being talked about prior to COVID, because we started to realise that the work-life balance bit was a problem. We had good data coming from the BVA around motivation, satisfaction, and retention in the workplace, and all these sorts of stuff. And it was all kind of pointing towards that direction. Now, I think when we first started having this conversation, it was all about, we think it's about working mothers and so on and so forth. Actually, the data doesn't support that. As I've said multiple times, the third most common reason for wanting flexible working is caring duties. Above that, it's leisure activities and so on. At one point, the highest rate of people going part-time in our profession were men over 50, rather than working age women. If you think back to then, what it was when, they were coming to retirement or they were selling their practices and so on, and actually they decided, I want a bit more me time, which is
Yeah.
perfectly acceptable. And so I think over time it has gone from this concept to this perception that it's just about working women, to actually going, this is more than that, and actually there are more ways to do it than just part-time. I think COVID slightly accelerated it, but interestingly, I think it accelerated it for a different reason. Our clients then started having different working patterns as well. So as soon as our clients start having different working patterns, their desire to come into the practice and the hours in which they want to come into the practice also changed. So whereas historically people would be commuting backwards and forwards and they could only come in the evenings, and because that's when they got off the train and got the dog and brought the dog to the practice, now they're working from home, and actually they'll call you in the morning and go, my dog's got a sore ear. And you say, can you come in at 1:45? Yeah, sure, I'll take my lunch then, I'll come in at 1:45. Whereas 5 years ago, when less people were working from home, the
Yeah.
answer would be, no, actually, I can only do it after 6. So with the changing patterns of our clients, I think it has made flexible working more accessible for our teams as well.
Yeah. And do you think, I think we touched upon it very slightly earlier, but how do you think flexible working, helps to combat burnout and stress and, work-life balance?
So I think it does, but I think we need to be careful about not putting all our eggs in one basket, right? So
Yeah.
if you are at work for the hours that suit you and your lifestyle for whatever reason, medical reason, caring reason, leisure reasons, personal reasons, it doesn't really matter. But if you are able to work a pattern that makes you happier as an individual, it means you will be happier at work. It means that you'll have that bit more headspace, that bit more capacity to deal with the uncertainty, with the difficulties that come through the door and so on. You will have more downtime, or more appropriate downtime, should I say, which means you'll have more rest time and so on. So flexible working will help to a degree with burnout, but burnout is such a complex issue that we can't just pin it all on flexible working. You've got a flexible working pattern, therefore you're not going to get burnt out. No, it also depends on the culture of your practice, the workload within your practice, and so on and so forth. So is flexible working really important part of it? Absolutely. But practice culture and ways of working are just as important.
Brilliant. No, that sounds great. And do you think there's any, because I know some people, might say if you go part-time, or if, you don't work the sort of traditional
Mhm.
full-time, hours, you might be overlooked for things like promotions, and, you don't progress in your career as quickly as you might have wanted to. Do you think that there's any sort of truth in that?
Yes. And we'll talk about what I think is the reality yes and the unfair yes. So the reality yes that I say. So interestingly, when I was at vet school, I went through a phase that I wanted I was considering mixed practice, right? And the reason I ultimately didn't go for mixed practice is because I thought I will spend less time on each area therefore it will take me longer to get as good. Now, that's just a function of time, right? So if I'm spending 50% of my time on small animal, 50% on farm, I will progress slightly slower clinically than I would someone doing 100% farm or 100% small, right?
Yeah.
So when it comes to, particularly if you're doing part-time hours, if we use the part-time aspect of flexible working, there may be some, I don't know, slight delay in the way that you develop clinically, but that's just because you're seeing less cases, right? And so someone sees 10 cases a week, you see 5, there's going to be naturally going to be that sort of difference. Now, that sort of difference only really happens at the early stage of your career, right? By the time you get to where I was when I left practice, whether I saw 5 cases or 10 cases, my development was going at the same speed. So that issue around development is probably only early on in your career where you lack the experience, and therefore it takes you slightly longer time. Now, that's just the reality of it. Now, the unfair bit is about the career progression bit, which is where you are right. So, and this is not just about flexible working. So the BVA did a study a while ago around gender discrimination in the profession, for example, where you had 2 CVs, Mark and Elizabeth, both absolutely completely identical CVs. They asked hiring managers, would you, how competent would you say they are? Would you put them in positions of leadership? Do you think they're trustworthy role models for the team? How much would you pay them? Separately, they asked them whether they felt that, whether the hiring manager felt women still faced or didn't face discrimination in the profession. Across the board, Mark was seen more competent, he would have been paid more, would have been put forward for promotion, etc., etc. But the difference was more pronounced in those that didn't believe that discrimination still existed. Now, the reason I bring that up is I suspect if you were to do the same study for part-time working, you'd probably get the same sort of results, where there's an assumption. And therefore, there is an unfairness that people who work part-time may find it harder. And the onus on that is for hiring managers and leaders to actually take into account people's capabilities, not the hours that they're working. And also because there is still this perception that part-time working is about women. Again, you put that all on top of it. So there is a risk, particularly for part-time working, that could be the case. And I think the onus is on leaders and hiring managers to actually recruit and promote in as unbiased a way as possible to make sure that they get the best people for the job. It may be that if you say you're looking for clinical directors, you could have 2 part-time clinical directors. It could be a job share. There's no reason for it not to be a job share anymore. Leadership positions don't need to be full-time anymore. So yes, I think that they will face challenges, but they shouldn't.
I remember we did a podcast with Justine from the BVA around discrimination, and it just blew my mind that it was but sadly.
So that first discrimination study was the one that I did, and if you look at the data, it's pretty bad, and that's why, in answer to your question, I don't have the data that flexible working will make the difference. But actually, if you extrapolate, I think it will. And I think if you look at those who are in leadership positions now, it is still more common to see a full-time person in a leadership position than it is someone who's part-time. And bear in mind, part-time could be 30 hours a week instead of 40 hours a week. It's not a big factor. If you're working 10 hours a week, I don't think you can be, a clinical director or so on. But there are challenges out there that shouldn't be out there.
Brilliant, thank you. And I guess as well, from a kind of team on the ground, so to speak, perspective, do you think there's any sort of issues that can arise with flexible working in terms of communication and cohesion?
Absolutely. And that's why when we were talking at the beginning, the most important thing about flexible working is communication. And there's a couple of reasons why tension and cohesion can come up. So when it comes to continuity of care, if you're not communicating with your teams appropriately, handing over cases, etc., you do run the risk of ill feeling developing when people who are there full time or even if they're just there the days you don't work, if they feel that there hasn't been a good enough handover and they're being dumped complex cases, then naturally that's going to happen. But I think the other point where communication is really important is when line managers are making decisions around flexible working, being really clear in their communication as to why or why not a flexible working request has been accepted. or why there's been an adjustment or a suggested adjustment to the request. Because, when at IVC we did a flexible working push about 2 years ago, 18 months ago. And one of the things that people were worried about was everyone would want Friday afternoon off, and therefore they'd get to a point that they'd have no one working Friday afternoon. Now, the reality is you do not have to say yes to a flexible working request if it's detrimental to the business, right? So if one person comes and says, I'd like to not work Fridays, and actually the business can do that, fine, like that's the right thing to do. But by the time the third or the fourth person asks, then that's not okay to do. And at that point, it's just where you have to be really clear as to why you're saying no this time. And also, you don't have, saying yes to a flexible working request doesn't set a precedent. And again, that's something that needs to be communicated really clearly to team members, that every flexible working request is dealt with as an individual request as well.
Brilliant. And I guess just sort of looking ahead, how do you sort of see flexible working evolving, in the coming years?
That's a really interesting question. I think, I hope we will see more hybrid working in our profession. And I know that sounds slightly controversial, but I'll explain why. And it's worth, before I talk, saying that this is not practically possible for every business or every practice at the moment. But I think as we become more digitally competent as a profession, I do think hybrid working will be more appropriate. So if we think about, let's take farm practice first, because I think that would be the easiest one to do. If you're wanting to communicate with farmers with results, herd health plan results, blood results, test results, whatever, do you really have to be sitting in the office to do that? If you have a cloud-based system, could you work flexibly from home and report your results from home, for example? And even though we're far away from it when it comes to small animal work yet, there may well come a point that that's possible in the small animal world as well. If you work 4 days a week and your rota says that the Wednesday afternoon is your admin day, and you've communicated to your clients that you always report results on a Wednesday afternoon unless there's an emergency, why couldn't you be working from home in a hybrid manner to report your results? Now, that's where I think we will end up. I don't know how quickly we'll end up there, because it does rely on us being digitally competent and capable, and that will be a different speed for all different practices and businesses. I think it'll be an option. Not everyone will want to do it. So obviously now I work from home quite a bit. It can get lonely sometimes. And I do really miss being surrounded by people. So sometimes just going to work in a practice for the sake of working in a practice is the best thing I could possibly do. I hope we get to a point where flexible working is seen as the norm, but that it's seen as the norm with an understanding from both the employee and the employer that it's a two-way street. That it's not just about the employee's wants, that it's about the business and animal needs as well. So I hope that I'm not having this conversation with you in 5 years' time. It's just so normal that it's not a thing anymore.
Absolutely. And final question, sorry, I know we're running out of time, but is there anywhere that you'd like to sort of signpost people, or anywhere, where there's some good resources that people can access to do with flexible working?
Yeah, so BVA have some really, really good resources around flexible working to help you either as a line manager or as an individual understand. It's part of their Good Workplace initiative, so that would be where I would go to. But I would also say that anyone that's listening, your employer should have some good resources as well. Whether you work for a corporate, an independent, it doesn't really matter. They will have resources as well. Resources that will help you understand what their flexible working policy is, the process by which you need to go through to request flexible working, and things like ACAS and so on will also have the legal standing. So, it is becoming such a norm in society that there's plenty of stuff out there. BVA have the veterinary specific stuff. Also talk to your employer, whoever they are. Talk to your employer, see what their policies are, and see if they could benefit you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Daniella. Yeah, it's really interesting times, isn't it? And I think with the change in government as well, I think it's all going to change even further again, isn't it, from next year? So absolutely. Interesting times. Oh, well, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been great to hear your thoughts, and we hope to see you again soon.